Genesis is not just America's newest luxury car brand, they're also one of the most prolific in terms of product development. Over the few short years that Genesis has been a standalone brand, they have developed more standalone models than it took Lexus about 20 years to create. And now they're shifting their focus towards electrification, and they're doing it in typical Genesis gangbusters fashion. This calendar year, we're going to get 3 full battery electric vehicles from Genesis, soon followed by a 4th that they have not announced yet, but we all know is coming. This is the all-new Genesis GV60, the luxury cousin, I guess you could say, of the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6. This is a luxury sort of subcompact crossover slotted between something like a Volvo XC40 and an XC60. If you're looking for a full battery electric Genesis crossover that's more Model Y sized or perhaps XC60 sized, that's going to be the electric GV70. That's going to be on sale a little bit later this year. And if you'd really love an electric sedan from Genesis, that's the G80, and that should be on sale also a little bit later this year. 3 rows, more of a competitor to a Tesla Model X. That's going to be on sale probably early next year, and it's likely going to be called the GV90. Genesis has not announced it, but we all know that it's coming shortly after these go on sale. As a separate brand, Genesis has not been around all that long, and they're still trying to define their corporate style. We don't know whether all of the future Genesis models are going to look like Russian nesting dolls, but this certainly does not, compared with the rest of the lineup, although there are still some styling cues that are shared, like the headlamp modules that are split apart by a body-colored section. Headlights are actually in 2 separate modules right there. These are multi-module full LEDs. We also don't have the same sort of shield motif that we find in other Genesis models, although it is mimicked by this little tiny triangle there and this larger opening below. This is not all grille as you'd expect in an EV. The only cooling is happening right down there at the bottom, but they wanted to give the look definitely a more cohesive vibe in terms of the rest of the Genesis lineup. Going in for a closer look at the headlight modules, you notice that the headlamps themselves are just the upper and lower 2 modules on the inside. The outer 6 modules are daytime running lights and amber turn signals. Now let's talk dimensions. At 177.8 inches long, this is almost exactly the same size as the Lexus UX and a little bit longer than the XC40 Recharge. It's right around the same size as the new Volvo C40. The C40 and the XC40, in my opinion, are the 2 most direct competitors in the United States to this at the moment, because we don't have the Mercedes-Benz GLB EV just yet. That is coming very, very soon. It's going to be a little bit longer than this, and it's going to have an available teeny tiny 3rd row, which I'm really intrigued by. The rear of the GV60 is definitely styled differently from the GV70 and GV80, although there's still some family cues, like this tail lamp module that's bisected by the body color section, just like what was going on up front with the headlights. This very large spoiler is on top of the rear glass, so when you're looking through the rearview mirror, you're mainly looking through the upper section of the glass, but you're also looking through this dark tinted section just below the spoiler. It's very discreet on the outside, so it doesn't look quite like a Prius back here in terms of being able to see through the glass to the inside, but it's really obvious when you're looking through that rearview mirror. At the moment, there are going to be 2 ways to get your GV60, with or without the performance option. The base version is going to be dual motor. It has a 214 horsepower motor in the back, actually just a little over 214 horsepower, and approximately 100 horsepower on the front axle. If you get the performance model, then they basically transplant the motor from the back up to the front to give you 429 horsepower total. Then they give you a boost mode to bump things up to 483 horsepower for about 10 seconds. Because controlling all that power is pretty tricky, Genesis also gives the performance model an electronically controlled limited slip differential. But this will still peel out from a stop, and then again at around 30 miles an hour or so. We're going to talk about that in the drive section. Range comes in between 248 miles and 235 miles, depending on the version that you get. Obviously, the lower range figure is going to be in this performance trim. Now, in case you're wondering, this is a dedicated battery electric vehicle platform, but it was not designed to have an enormous front trunk. It has just a small pizza box right there under the hood. Just about enough room to store your EVSE, the charge cable, maybe a California Duster or something along those lines. If you were to open this little section up, then you will see some of the drivetrain components under here, which, combined with the fact that all GV60s are going to be all-wheel drive, so there's a secondary motor under here, is why we don't have a larger storage area. If you're one of the limited number of people that plans on towing with their small electric crossover, fear not, the GV60 has a rated tow rating of 2,000 pounds on all models. The seating position for the driver is not quite as upright as the Volvo XC40, but not quite as reclined as the Lexus UX. This seat is significantly more comfortable than I had expected it to be honest, because I didn't expect Genesis to give us things like a power extending thigh cushion or front seat massage, or the ability to inflate and deflate the seat bottom cushion. Basically what they did was they gave it a bladder at the seat bottom, and it feels like you're sitting on an exercise ball that's inflating and deflating to change the contour of the seat bottom cushion. We also have inflatable side bolsters, four-way adjustable lumbar support, a powered tilt telescopic steering column, and all of it's controlled by a two-position memory on the door and a driver memory system in the instrument cluster and infotainment system. With the front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have tons of legroom back here, significantly more than you'll find in the Polestar 2 or the Volvo C40. I have about 4.5 to 5 inches of legroom left, meaning you could probably put a small rear-facing child seat back here if you needed to, but the driver could adjust their seat to a more upright position and then it would be totally fine. The other thing you'll notice back here is that because this is based on the eGMP platform, also shared with the Ioniq 5 and the EV6, that the back seat is wider across than most of the subcompact luxury competition, certainly making this feel more comfortable and more spacious back here. This is the kind of vehicle where it would be a lot more comfortable to put 3 adults across the back. Headroom is a little bit more limited than I had expected. If I try to put my head back to the headrest, I do have to kind of crane my head to one side in order to do that. But sitting in a more natural seating position like this, where I would normally be as long as I wasn't trying to sleep back here, then I have about 3/4 of an inch left. And this does have a panoramic moonroof, although it doesn't open. You'll also notice the size back here if I move over to the middle seat position. Headroom is still pretty generous here. My hair is now brushing the ceiling, and again, I have to crane my head in order to put my head back there to the headrest, but plenty of room back here. Now, the way the center console is designed, there's not as much foot room back here for the middle passenger, even though we have a completely flat floor. Behind the power hatch, we find 24 cubic feet of cargo space. That's definitely better than we find in the XC40 or the C40 Recharge. It is, however, the smallest of the eGMP triplets in the United States. This cargo area, however, is squarer than what we find in the Kia EV6, and that resulted in the same number of 24-inch roller bags being able to slot back here as in the Kia. This one came in at 4. As we look around the interior together, keep in mind this is the top-end performance model, although much of what you see in here is also going to be found in the base trim. This model has the imitation suede headliner, sunglass holder right there, power sunshade control for this power sunshade on the moonroof. Now, this moonroof does not open and it does not impact rear passenger headroom. As you can see, it's not above that rear passenger headrest. From this angle, you can see what I was talking about earlier as far as the view out the rear window being split by that spoiler in the rear. I'm definitely partial to glass roofs with some sort of shading mechanism, but you should know that this glass roof does not improve front seat headroom because of that portion of the ceiling right there. As it angles up, your head's really over that part as well. Moving over to the front doors, we have tons of soft touch materials. The interior is really, really nicely done in this vehicle. Lots of stitched goods. You can see those stitched materials on the upper section of the dashboard and on the upper section of the doors. Lots of round design theme accents, round speaker grills, accents there on the passenger door, round door handle. Over there we have unique switchgear for the Genesis lineups. This does not share window switches, etc. with the other vehicles. This blue interior is unique to the performance trim, and I have to say I really, really like this one. Again, it kind of reminds me of the Hyundai Nexo with the way these air vents are positioned in the dashboard. That was one of the first vehicles out of this conglomerate to have a 2-screen setup in the dash, although the screens are smaller than the ones that we see here. Over on the passenger side, we have a bin-style pull-out glove compartment. It's kind of an interesting touch there. As you can see, the main screen supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay integration, and that integration occupies the entire screen. In addition to a touchscreen, we also have a rotary controller similar to what we find in other Genesis models. Up here we find controls for the volume up, down, tune, home menu, menu button, etc. right there. At the very bottom of the dashboard, we have 2 USB ports. One is the interface for Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Wireless CarPlay is not supported. The other is a charge-only port. As you can see, we have essentially a flat floor in here. There is one floor mat that crosses that divide, and then we have that teeny tiny little storage bin there where you can toss your smartphone. There's also a 12-volt power port. Then we have a really eccentric center console. This is open all the way from this section all the way back here through the rear. Due to the tight confines of the car, it's a bit difficult to film, but you can see that we have a little fabric net right there to help keep things in. That's the rear view. Then if we go up and over the console, there is something very similar up front, so you can store your goodies in there. Then we come to the party piece for the GV60, which is the shifter. If we turn the vehicle off, that rotates around to give us this sort of glowing orb design. If I turn the car back on, it powers back into place and then rotates around for the shifter. Over on the driver's side, we find a full LCD instrument cluster and a full color heads-up display. The theme of this instrument cluster changes a little bit based on the drive mode, so that's comfort, that's sport. You can see primarily some color changes there and a few animations, and that's the eco mode. If I engage boost mode by pressing this button on the steering wheel, then the power gauge goes all the way along to the boost section right there, with a little boost ready icon over there to tell you how much boost you have. On the left side of the instrument cluster, we have an information readout display that is controlled via this touch slider on the steering wheel, very much like we find in some Mercedes models. You toggle up to down, side to side. Now, if it's not active in that section, if you don't see that little line around that box, then this is going to act like track forward, backward for the infotainment system. There's a programmable favorite button there, a mode change button that's also programmable, boost mode, toggle for the volume, push in for mute, voice command button over there. Then on this side of the steering wheel, we have the controls for the standard radar adaptive cruise control button, and then another programmable button, drive mode toggle right there on the steering wheel. And then over on the driver's side, it's worth seeing this because the circular section that we found over there on the passenger side becomes the control for the side view mirrors. You rotate that around and then toggle up, down, side to side for the mirror controls. And then again, we have more unique switch gear for the windows, locking things, etc. And then the seat memory buttons are right there up front. Before we get the GV60 out on the road, let's talk about how we get into the GV60 to get it out on the road. You don't need the key anymore because Genesis is incorporating facial recognition and fingerprint recognition in order to drive the vehicle. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop this key over here, then we'll talk about how we get in the GV60. Integrated into the rear door, not the front door, is a facial recognition camera. To activate it, I look at the camera and then I put my finger on the front door. It grants me access because it's recognized me. Now I just hop inside. On the inside, we find a glowing fingerprint button. I simply put my finger on that. The car says I've been authenticated, so now I can go ahead and put my foot on the brake, press the power button, and the car turns on. Out on the road, the three big numbers to know are 7.9, 4.1, and 3.8. 0 to 60 happens in 7.9 seconds in this vehicle if you're in eco mode because it basically disables the front electric motor. When you take off from a start, things are kind of throttled down a little bit, and then after your initial launch, the front motor is disabled in order to improve fuel economy. 4.1 seconds is what you get with the front motor engaged all the time, and you'll find that in normal mode or sport mode, 0 to 60 is essentially the same in both of those. Now 3.8, that's the crazy that happens when you engage boost mode and floor the GV60. This is incredibly quick. Balancing the power to electric motors is a little bit tricky, which is why we get the boost mode. They don't want you to be able to do this all the time without preparation. And here's why. If I hit the boost mode at a stop and then I floor it, I get some wheel spin, and then I get more wheel spin right at around 30 miles an hour. And that's because even though this has a ton of power and pretty big tires, Genesis realized they could not give you all the power and all the torque to the front electric motor right away. They've got to wait a little while till the vehicle's really moving, so that way you can apply all that power. Otherwise, the front tires would just spin and spin and spin as you're accelerating. So if this had even grippier tires, they could probably have dialed that up even more aggressively and really made this incredibly quick 0 to 60. Even as it is, because there is so much wheel slip going on at launch and again at 30 miles an hour, this could probably be swifter 0 to 60 than 3.8 seconds if you simply swapped in summer tires. In terms of ride quality, the big difference between the performance and the non-performance version of the GV60 is that this model has an adaptive suspension system. Now, this type of adaptive suspension controls the damping characteristics, but it cannot adjust the spring rate. So in order to have a comfortable ride for a surface like I'm on here, they tune the springs towards the softer side of things and the dampers to the softer side of things as well. That results in a ride that honestly feels a bit bigger than the GV60 is. This rides more like, I would say, a BMW X5 or a Volvo XC60 or XC90. It has a larger presence out on the road, and it certainly soaks up potholes like those two big bumps that I just went over there really, really well. Speed bumps, things like that, broken pavement, washboard pavement. This handles everything incredibly well. The reason that I'm going a little out of order here is that this adaptive suspension seems just a little bit at odds with the performance mission of the performance trim of the GV60. In terms of adaptive modes, Genesis basically gives us two: firm and soft. In the soft mode, things are pretty cushy, just as I would like for a longer road trip. In the firmest suspension mode, which I'm currently in now, we still get a reasonable amount of body roll and still a reasonable amount of tip and dive, and you'll really notice that if I get this out onto an even tighter winding road like the one here. Acceleration is absolutely incredible. Absolutely no problem with acceleration, but the suspension can feel just a little bit unusual, I guess is probably the best definition. This is something that you'll likely get used to, but right out of the box, it doesn't feel quite like anything else in this group. In terms of suspension tuning, the Audi, BMW, and Volvo options are all going to be firmer than this, and they're going to be a little bit more consistent in their nature. This comes across as a little bit less polished, a little less sorted, but I'm not talking about how the suspension performs over broken pavement. The rear tires don't really lose adhesion or anything like that. It's just that if you're really pushing this to the limits that this car is capable of, the suspension kind of wobbles and bounds over things here and there. I really wish that Genesis would have given this slightly firmer springs in the performance model, perhaps a little bit less of a variation in terms of the suspension tuning between the firm and the soft version. This really is more of a highway cruiser, more of a grand tourer. Even though we have those incredible 0 to 60 times, it's not as much of a sports car as some people might want. If you're looking for something that's luxurious and quick when you want it, that's certainly the GV60. If you're looking for something that's going to expertly carve every corner or maybe double as a track car, you're going to find that somewhere else. And I think part of that is the cabin quietness. This is a much more hushed cabin than we find in the Kia or the Hyundai. I measured 69.5 decibels in here, meaning that this is about as quiet as a BMW X5, which is one of the quietest vehicles that we've tested here, certainly punching above its weight in terms of cabin isolation. When it comes to range and efficiency, Genesis did an excellent job with the GV60. I've averaged 3.85 miles per kilowatt hour over a week of driving this vehicle, and on my road trip range test, that went up to about 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour, putting this right around 230 miles of real-world range, as long as we're talking about road tripping range. That's just a little bit below the EPA window sticker score, which is actually a good showing for this, since the EPA window sticker is a blend of city driving and highway driving. Most EVs generally get a little bit higher in terms of city driving. Without doubt, the GV60 is one of the best EVs that I've ever driven, but I would tweak a few things if I could. I would tweak the suspension tuning. I think that it's just not quite appropriate for the kind of power and the rest of the sporty intention that we have in the GV60. I would love to see perhaps this amount of power in a GV60 with a regular steel spring suspension to see what that would be like. I would also love to see wider tires or summer tires available from the factory, because that really would match the kind of performance that we get out of this. 4.1 seconds 0 to 60 without trying this boost mode, which really seems to have no limits. You can just keep re-engaging it 10 seconds after 10 seconds after 10 seconds. I'm assuming that eventually the vehicle would say you can't have any more until the battery cools down, but somehow I have not managed to hit that particular point. For me, at least, those are relatively minor quibbles, especially because you can swap in summer tires yourself. Now, if you want to know how this is priced and how this stacks up against the competition, be sure and click on over to part 2 of this video. You're going to find a link down there in the description. You will also find a button at the very end of this video on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Just go ahead and click onto that. That's going to take you over to part 2 of this video. And if you aren't interested in that, I'll just see you next week.